Kamusta ka? Okay, I'm gonna jump right into the topic without much introduction because this is purely a proletarian feminist rant about a specific niche in the right-wing pragmatic gender equalist tradition, liberal feminism, that has been severely bothering me for years, and I've never been able to put it into words until I wrote this 20-page script. The girl bossification of female monarchs and other aristocratic women. This usually takes place as the dramatization through a reactionary, supposedly pro-woman lens of the lives of female monarchs in fiction, history, and the modern day, as a means of trying to revise history to paint them, and in turn monarchism in general, in a more progressive light. Since the invention of feudalism, the ruling class has always tried to deify their female class members as examples of the role women must aspire to play within the constraints of their society, aka used as tools to appease to and subordinate peasant and working women. However, the rise of feminist monarchs, both in the media and real life, are clearly symptoms of the disease that is liberal feminism. And of course, when I refer to liberal feminism, I mean the mainstream bastardization of the women's liberation movement created and promoted by bourgeois women and adopted by many proletarian women who live in dictatorships of the bourgeoisie and thus are force-fed pro-capitalist propaganda since they could breathe. Anyway, the logic of many liberal feminist support for monarchism is that monarchy, despite being a feudal relic, is somehow not inherently tied to women's subordination, and thus we don't need to overthrow the monarchy. What we need to do is make sure that aristocratic women have the same property and inheritance rights than aristocratic men. And why will that be more effective than abolishing the monarchy? Because more women in positions of power definitely means more better living standards for all women, including working and peasant class women, because they will be more sympathetic to their plight because they're the same gender. Totally. Great analysis, liberal feminism. The only problem is that the argument is not supported by any historical or material reality. But liberalism is not based on historical materialism, it's based on idealism and protecting the interests of the capitalist class. So we shouldn't be surprised that liberal feminists, the media, and academia are leaning into this girlboss monarchist archetype to try to make feminist icons off of women that, once again, are part of an institution that inherently benefits from the subordination of working class and peasant women. Look at this mess. Was Up Ireland Queen Elizabeth a feminist? Here is 5 reasons why. Let's look at them. She drove a Saudi prince. Ojo, when driving was illegal in Saudi Arabia. Muy interesante, muy bien, muy bonito. Just one question, what impact did that have on Saudi working class women's struggle against institutionalized patriarchy in their kingdom? And does that really mean anything if she continued to have good relations with that royal family due to her country's imperialist interests in their oil and other natural resources? Of course, this girl bossification is not only present in historical revisionism conducted against very dead, finally dead monarchs, from Meghan Markle to Rania of Jordan to Margrethe of Denmark to Queen Jetson Penna and Queen Letizia. The girl bossification of women in royal families today is in full effect. And we're not even safe from this propaganda in the movie theaters and in TV shows, where we're in theory, but not really, supposed to be allowed some escapism from the constraints of the material interests of the bourgeois class. Shows like The Crown, Bridgerton, The House of the Dragon, Game of Thrones, Blood, Sex and Royalty, The Empress, the Harry Meghan documentary, Reign, and even movies like Wakanda Forever are just shoving the stupid ahistorical Billie Eilish "you should see me in a crown, Halsey, I'm heading straight for the castle" female monarchs that we're supposed to idolize and make girl power edits of to distract us from the impending man-made climate catastrophe caused by the greed of the capitalist class.
The last man holding his sword can find a new queen to fight for.
Okay, fine, yeah, that was a bit dramatic, and I'm not gonna sit here and pretend like I'm not a huge Game of Thrones fan and I didn't enjoy Wakanda Forever so much that I watched it twice. I was a huge Reign fan when I was a child, and obviously no, not because of the plot line and not because of the historical accuracy. It's because I was in love with Lady Kenna. Working on a Grammy, meanwhile, pussy popping with your man in Miami. Enjoying these films and these shows is totally natural, especially when you have people like Angela Bassett playing such an interesting character. And I was personally screaming, crying, tearing up, laughing, and throwing up, with joy, mind you, when Sansa Stark was crowned Queen of the North. But we can't deny knowing that the bourgeois class has the monopoly over our culture and our media and our academic institutions, that the historical revisions and, safe to say, most of the media depictions of feminist monarchs are clearly presenting an argument in favor of the monarchy that is purple wash, and tries to make an argument for making the monarchy more inclusive to women, and specifically also women of racial minorities on the surface level, so that these monarchists, who are only in power because of some supposed divine right that they received from some god that allows them to be in control of your land, but with a face of an oppressor in that specific position that you might not recognize. The face of a woman. It's different now because she looks different from the oppressors from before. This argument is kind of based a little bit in misogyny, and it is oh so Eurocentric and oh so obviously an attempt to try to make an institution that is so racist and so colonial in and outside of the global south, because all of the monarchies from the global south that still exist today are around due to their collaboration with European powers and continued allegiance to the West, seem less racist and less colonial in order to make it more palatable to an international proletariat that is growing more marginalized and more class conscious and more opposed to what the monarchy represents. The literal love of my life and my best friend, Your Aries Retrospective, talks about this in more depth in this article, which you should check out, and also support her monetarily because her intellectual labor deserves to be rewarded. But a prime example of this racist purple washing strategy is the documentary Harry and Meghan. They could not just stop talking about how the British monarchy lost an opportunity to have someone who looks like the majority of people in the Commonwealth be a part of the royal family in order to convince those who want to leave the Commonwealth to stay for the benefit of the British monarchy. So progressive, yes, Queen. In my opinion, no one knows better at critiquing types of supposedly feminist pro-women standpoints than Indian revolutionary and proletarian feminist Anuradha Gandhi. And I often think of her critique of liberal feminism outlined in pages 37 through 40 in her book, The Philosophical Trends of the Feminist Movement, when thinking about the girlbossification of female monarchs. So for the sake of making a more coherent argument against this niche of liberal feminism and to plug her book for baby leftists, I am going to use the 6 weaknesses of liberal feminism outlined by Gandhi in these pages to further explain my disdain for this fairly recent monarcho-feminist ideological development, in the hopes that somewhere in the near future we can finally put this feudal relic, this rotting corpse that is the monarchy, to rest in a grave 6 feet under, instead of finding new purple washed and even probably pink washed and fake diversity and inclusion ways of justifying their continued colonial, white supremacist, patriarchal, classist existence. To begin, believing that the ability to have a female monarch will advance women's liberation as a whole is a flawed conclusion because it focuses on individual rights rather than collective rights. More specifically, It focuses on the individual right of a woman to become queen in her own right. This includes, of course, changing the inheritance laws from agamatic or male primogeniture to absolute primogeniture, or having control over vast amounts of private land, waging war for her supposed right to her title. These individual so-called rights to private property, solely based on who their parents are, is portrayed by these monarcho-feminists and people arguing that we must reform the monarchy to be more gender inclusive and not completely abolish it, as some type of empowering fight for female autonomy for a single individual, a powerful aristocratic woman. But these reforms and battles do literally nothing to improve the collective rights of women in the actual kingdom, commonwealth, and or empire. Just allows the noble women to seize power just the same as their male class counterparts whom they share the same class interests as. Secondly, believing that a female monarch will work on the side of working class women to advance women's liberation as a whole is ahistorical. It does not have a comprehensive understanding of women's role in history, nor has it any analysis of the subjugation of women. Thinking that a woman reigning as a monarch of a feudal relic will somehow make the institution serve the interests of women is just not grounded in any historical materialism, especially considering that the emergence of the feudal system meant the emergence of private property, which is the root of women's subordination. In the eyes of feudalists and capitalists alike, and thus monarchs alike, women workers and peasants are factories for future laborers. Meanwhile, aristocratic women are factories for future heirs. Therefore, laborial and sexual exploitation forced onto women to rear workers and heirs is not only incredibly important to the monarchy, but vital for its survival. Women are obliged to fulfill the wife-mother role in order to ensure the feudalist and capitalist system, and once again, thus the monarchist system, receives a steady supply of labor power. You can't have a kingdom if you don't have constituents who you can tax to keep your wealth in your crown. While the subordination of women of the peasantry and working classes by bourgeois, feudal, and monarchist societies is of primary concern to us proletarian feminists, as we usually don't really care to focus on serving the interests of aristocratic and land-owning women, and since they're overwhelmingly supportive of our subordination as proletarians and as women, we also don't ignore that noble women's role in monarchist history has been the creator of heirs, the childbearer, the womb to carry the future king, or, as Engels put it, effectively prostitutes for the aristocracy. Aristocratic women spent years in a vicious cycle of pregnancy and birth. From the moment that they became a child bride until they reached menopause, or suffered a premature death due to birthing complications, namely that she was forced to carry too many children at too young of an age because her only value was creating children. No matter how important a queen may be, how influential, their purpose is to produce an heir. In most cases, more specifically, a male heir. When they fail at this role, political instability ensues and they are shamed. What is the literal plotline of the House of the Dragons right now, folks? What is the central problem? That the first wife of the king did not produce him a male heir. Let's think about this logically. If queens, the head of the state, the person part of the ruling class that is leading a country, that is glorified and deified by a country, if they can't even be seen by the monarchy as anything but a childbearer, how do you think they are going to make the monarchy see you as a human being? If they barely ever win any battles against the own institution that they benefit from, for that institution to treat them as more than wombs, how do you think they will be at all successful at advocating for your total liberation through reforming that institution? The monarchy is many things other than this as well, but the monarchy is inherently as an institution misogynist. The only examples in history where a monarchy has not been inherently misogynist has A, still been a classist institution that wasn't misogynist maybe towards its aristocratic women, but still expected lower class women to submit themselves to either men, the monarch, the female monarch, and they still needed women to be childbearers primarily and do unpaid domestic work so that these women confined to the home can raise as many children and have as many children as possible, so you can have more people that you can collect more taxes off. Because women's subordination is rooted in the existence of private property. But anyways, the secondly is because those pre-colonial monarchies that might have actually been more gender equalist towards their female class members don't exist anymore. We do live under Western hegemony. One of the most obvious symptoms of the patriarchal nature of monarchy itself is the history of sexual assault by aristocratic men against working and peasant women as well as other aristocratic women. Whether it be the noble-born women or girls being raped on their wedding night during their consummation and ever after by their husbands if they did not consent to marrying that man, which was often the case, or whether it be the prima nocta or droit du seigneur laws that exercise the, quote, right of feudal lords, kings, counts, dukes, you name it, to rape the peasant and working class women, subordinate women, living on their land on their wedding night. Or the countless amounts of working women who were forced into prostitution due to the miserable conditions of their existence caused by the greed of the monarchist class that were present at court or just outside of the castle, being financially coerced into these positions and sexually abused by these land-holding monarchs. Courts in Japan, China, France, the Ottoman Empire, and Al-Andalus had royal harems, mistresses, and concubines whose entire function was to please a sovereign sexually and produce bastard heirs, or just heirs in general, as was the case in the Ottoman Empire. The level of respect these women received depended on their perception by their own society. Some were highly respected members of the court to the extent that they were perceived as dutiful sexual objects that fulfilled their reproductive functions, or they lived a life of shaming, seclusion, and ridicule. No matter how they were perceived by their society, they were treated like sexual slaves. Harem, from the time of the Ottoman Empire known as the Sultanate of Women, is a prime example of this. As highly respected as she was, as much as her husband refused to sleep with any of his other concubines that lived in the harem and chose to marry her and make her sultana, she was not allowed to leave the harem. She was locked in there for life. She was not leaving. It's clear that to this day, with examples like Prince Andrew and countless other aristocratic men who have simply not been found out yet, this continues to be the way that aristocratic men look out and treat women. All women to them are wombs for future laborers and heirs, and sexual objects to be exploited by the male sovereign if he so pleases. To ignore the historical analysis of women's role in the feudal and capitalist societies ruled by a monarch and suggest that just because female monarchs now reign over this feudalist institution, the monarchy can now somehow be feminist, is historical and material revisionism of the highest degree. Thirdly, these feminist monarchs in question tend to be mechanical in their support for formal equality without a concrete understanding of the condition of different sections and classes of women and their specific problems. Hence, it is able to express the demands of aristocratic and bourgeois women, but not those of women from various oppressed ethnic groups, castes, and the working classes. This is primarily obvious in the examples used of feminist actions performed by these monarchs, changing the primogeniture laws, demanding to be praised and knelt by the common people despite their gender.
The only crime I have committed that you care about is that I am a woman who wears a crown.
A woman in power goes against nature itself. Men will never willingly bow to the weaker sex.
And they will suffer greatly for it.
Exerting their supposed right to own a plot of land due to who their parents were, despite their gender.
I am Daenerys Stormborn, of House Targaryen, of the blood of old Valyria. I am the dragon's daughter.
Aspiring to be head of government, expanding their wealth and power globally, etc. These are the demands of the very few amongst all women. These are demands that require the continuation of feudalism, colonialism, capitalism, and capitalism's highest stage, imperialism. All of these four things play a central role in the oppression of women. The women workers who labor in factories, homes, fields, offices, the peasant women who work for big landlords, including female landlords, who control 90% of the land in their country, which they cultivate for little to sometimes no pay. The colonized women subjected to brutal occupation and ethnic cleansing by a colonizing force who uses the weapon of sexual violence to annihilate an entire people group and subordinate their women. The women who struggle against imperialism, that highest stage that topples socially progressive governments and socialist states and installs the most right-wing fundamentalist parties and militias in power so that foreign capitalists can still control the resources of foreign lands. The imperialists who have an active hand in the expansion of the global sex trade, whose desire is to sexually exploit women in the global south, leads to towns and areas around foreign military bases being hotspots for sexual trafficking of women and children. The capitalists, the pimps, and the Johns who target and exploit the working class, ethnic minority, trans, and cis women in their home countries. The continuation of capitalism, feudalism, imperialism, and colonialism is the only way for these bourgeois women to achieve their desired version of female self-empowerment that they mistakenly call feminism. But the continuation of capitalism means the continuation of Jeffrey Epstein's, Prince Andrew's, the pigs that conducted the Mahmoudiyya rape and killings in Iraq against a 14-year-old girl and her family. The continuation of the murder and sexual abuse of women like Jennifer Laude by soldiers stationed in the global south to maintain Western imperial control over different parts of the world. The continuation of the Mohammed bin Salmans of the world, the Juan Carloses, Andrew Tates of the world. Bourgeois women's empowerment through the means of private property rights comes at the expense of the continuation of misogynist violence against the majority of women across the world. Thus, they are not allied to women's liberation, but instead allied to the patriarchy, which can only survive as long as private property does. Soviet Marxist feminist Alexandra Kollontai very clearly outlined this class distinction that separates the demands of working class and bourgeois women in her writing called The Social Basis of the Woman Question. I quote, "The women's world is divided, just as is the world of men, into two camps. The interests and aspirations of one group bring it close to the bourgeois class, while the other group has close connections to the proletariat, and its claims for liberation encompass a full solution to the women question. Thus, although both camps follow the general slogan of the liberation of women, their aims and interests are different. Each of the groups subconsciously takes its standing point from the interests and aspiration of its own classes, which gives a specific class coloring to the targets and tasks it sets for itself. Fourthly, the advocacy for women's equality for working class and peasant women that these feminist monarchs can promote are restricted to changes in the law, educational and employment opportunities, welfare measures, etc., and does not question the economic and political structures of society which give rise to patriarchal discrimination. Hence, it is reformist in its orientation, both in theory and in practice. Anuradha Gandhi's fourth critique of liberal feminism can be best applied to the noble women and men who market themselves as feminists by supporting women's education, women-owned businesses, and other reformist campaigns to better a small percentage of women's standing in society by giving them the opportunity to become part of the petty bourgeois class, without actually addressing how the economic and political structure that they, the noble men and women, themselves benefit from greatly contribute to women's continued oppression all over the world. As the revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg stated, people who pronounce themselves in favor of the method of legislative reform in place of and in contradistinction to the conquest of political power and social revolution do not really choose a more tranquil, calmer, and slower road to the same goal, but a different goal. Instead of taking a stand for the establishment of a new society, they take a stand for surface modifications of the old society. The old society in question, capitalist and monarchist society, being one that requires the subordination of women, which very nicely segues into our fifth critique of this type of so-called feminism. Monarchs and people who support monarchy, who supposedly also support gender equality, believes that the state, and in this case the monarchist state, is neutral and can be made to intervene in favor of women, when in fact they are patriarchal and will not support women's struggle for emancipation. The state is defending the interests of the ruling classes who benefit from the subordination and devalued status of women. A capitalist state, an absolute monarchy, a constitutional monarchy, a semi-feudal and semi-colonial society is not neutral or malleable. It is a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie that serves their interests and their interests only. It is in the interest of this ruling class, this aristocratic land-holding class, to maintain control over the means of production as capital. And in a world where labor power is a commodity, these workers are seen as commodities. Those who have the power to physically create workers, namely those who have been assigned female at birth, whether or not they identify as such, are producers of that commodity and thus must be controlled by the ruling class. And they are controlled by the ruling class through patriarchy. Some will call me crazy for stating that. Some will say, well, these constitutional monarchy, social democracies like in the Nordic countries, Spain and England, are examples of bourgeois society siding with women, as women have better rights there than in presumably other dictatorships of the bourgeoisie, and that because women have more rights in these Western constitutional monarchies, change really can be enacted to create a non-patriarchal society under the rule of a king or a queen in a constitutional monarchy that has limited power over the government, or in an absolute monarchy with the approval of a feminist sovereign who pragmatically advances society into a better age, like Mohammed bin Salman is advancing Saudi society into. Or the former Shah who allowed miniskirts. Let's address both of these points, starting with that of the Nordic countries, whose rulers are applauded for their female heads of government and female heirs and their precedence over a legislatively progressive society as feminist and forward-thinking. Okay, let's talk about that. To say that women under constitutional monarchies have achieved liberation and live in a society that is pro-women due to the passing of laws regarding abortion access, voting and property rights for women, and there being more women in power in and outside of the monarchy, however, is demonstrably false. They might have switched to absolute primogeniture when it comes to the succession laws and done other symbolic gestures that hint at support for gender equality, but societies of the Nordic countries which they preside over still are extremely misogynist and promote violence against women. A few small examples include Norway's marital rape problem that is embedded in cultural expectations for wives and women, a societal norm not properly combated by their so-called feminist government. Even by neoliberal standards of what makes a society feminist, by the way, Norway doesn't hit the mark. What feminist society would breed the man responsible for the 2011 Oslo attacks? Various reports by Swedish feminists highlight the problem of sexist hate speech in their country, and even the women in power in the fifth most gender-equal country in the world are subject to higher scrutiny than their male counterparts for dancing at a private party or whatnot. And who can ignore the rising influence that the Sweden Democrats, neo-Nazis turned political candidates, have over Swedish politics? The Sweden Democrats that, of course, fervently support the supposedly feminist Swedish monarchy. Denmark is also a deeply misogynist country that, despite its surface-level laws that are supposedly pro-women, are deeply entrenched in rape culture. Every day there is instances of sexual harassment against women in the streets, in bars, trains, buses, workplaces, and at school. And what's worse, due to the reformist laws passed to make the previously mentioned old society look better on the surface when it comes to women's rights, the socio-political climate in Denmark, which is overwhelmingly a pro-monarchist one, is of disdain towards what they call radical feminism. Danes don't call themselves feminists because they think the title will stigmatize them as free bleeders or fourth-wave feminists. That the call for true equality is stigmatized so heavily by Danish society shows us the true intended effect of this monarchical feminist approach to saving this patriarchal feudal relic called monarchy. It's almost as if you can't reform your way out of patriarchy, and what you actually need is both a radical redistribution of wealth and property, as well as a cultural revolution that totally eradicates, through strict and non-pacifist means, these backwards and anti-people feelings towards women. In the words of Vladimir Lenin in regards to these so-called feminist constitutional monarchies in the West, and all Western governments for that matter, the representatives of all liberal movements in Western Europe, not only for decades but for centuries, demanded the abolition of these sexist, obsolete laws and the establishment of legal equity between men and women. But not a single European democratic state, not one of these most advanced republics, has succeeded in achieving this, because where capitalism exists, where the private ownership of the land, the private ownership of the factories and work is preserved, where the power of capital is preserved, men will retain their privileges. And yeah, it's the same situation for countries outside of the West and absolute monarchies like that of Saudi Arabia, though because this is a country situated in the big bad Middle East where the evil brown people are from, Western liberal feminists have less of a problem recognizing how anti-feminist these countries remain. The Crown Prince and his family members have been trying to save face on the international stage with these ridiculous performative displays of progress by giving them the right to drive, toma ya, feminismo, and other meaningless crumbs while continuing to overexploit their entire class and impress their entire gender, but of course more ferociously oppress working class and peasant Saudi women and let upper class women more off the hook. Or, as the daughter of one of the members of the Saudi royal family who went to the same class as me once said, "It's not fair to say that the Saudi monarchy doesn't let women do anything. Upper class women can do almost everything." Finally, since feminist monarchs and their monarcho-feminist supporters' perspectives on how to achieve equality focuses on changes in the law and state schemes for women, it has emphasized lobbying and petitioning as a means to get their demand. The liberal trend most often has restricted its activity to meetings and conventions and mobilizing petition calling for changes. It has rarely mobilized the strength of the mass of women and in fact is afraid of the militant mobilization of poor women in large numbers. That's because if the militant mobilization of working and peasant class women against patriarchy did indeed happen in their country, the first thing they'd have to attack is the very thing monarcho-feminists want to preserve: class society. Women's emancipation requires emancipation from class society, and the emancipation of class society does not happen through lobbying, petitioning, and other establishment-compliant means. That is why these establishment-compliant means are the only ones these monarcho-feminists advocate for. They do not want women's liberation. They need our continued subordination. They want to lie to our faces, tell us that we have won the fight for equality already because we have queens in their own right and power, because they rule over a country where you might have maternity leave but still run the risk of being sexually assaulted wherever you go, or shot in the head by a neo-Nazi incel who based their political opinions on the most pro-monarchist right-wing parties in your country. They want you to applaud them for changing the primogeniture laws while they still align themselves with the most fascist, anti-woman forces around the world to maintain their class hegemonic power over the means of production. They want you to suffer that misogynist violence, which they benefit from in every way, and still expect you to be respectful, pro-establishment, non-violent flowers, good law-abiding female subjects that are eternally loyal to them. As Anuradha Gandhi brilliantly said, by propagating women's nature as non-violent, they are discouraging women from becoming fighters in the struggle of their own liberation and that of society. In conclusion, death to the Girlboss Monarch. In Minecraft, death to her post, death to her title, death to the ruling class she is part of.
Death to all of them.
Not IRL, I'm not promoting that. Death to the unscientific glorifications of women in the monarchist institution. Death to her whitewashed image on screen funded by pro-monarchist propaganda. Death to her historical and fantasy shows. Death to her, death to her, death to her. She never truly existed anyway. She is a made-up fantasy by misogynists to justify their continued support for our class-based subordination. Put her to rest. Or may she abdicate, melt down the gold of her crown, return the stolen gems to their independent post-colonial nations, and join arms in the women's revolution in Minecraft. Oh my god, every time I try to record on here. Kumusta ka kasamas? I hope you enjoyed my video. I do have an ask of you. So at the beginning of February, we're going to have Anak Bayan National Congress, and it's very important for us to be able to send our representatives at Anak Bayan, Washington, D.C. to the West Coast to attend this conference in order to represent the interests of the Filipino masses on the East Coast, as well as help in the democratic process and decision-making for the upcoming campaigns in the next year. However, buying a transcontinental flight to the other coast of the United States is very costly. So we're trying to, as an organization, purchase the plane tickets ourselves in order to be able to send people who otherwise would not be able to go. to be representatives. This includes me. We are going to have a lot of in-person events in the Washington, D.C. area. And to keep up with those, you should follow our Instagram. We are planning a karaoke night where we'll probably be selling a lot of merch as well. But if you are national or international and you want to help, you can do so by donating to either our Venmo or my personal Cash App, and I can transfer it to our Venmo. It would be a huge help. My goal is to be able to, online-wise, raise a couple hundreds of dollars so that I and other Kasamas can attend. And if I attend, then I will reward you by making a vlog about the entire thing. That will be very entertaining. So please help us out. Once again, this is the Venmo and this is my Cash App where I will put that money into that Venmo. Anyway, this is coming out on Friday, so Shabbat Shalom. Please donate to Anak Bayan first and do not become a Patreon if you can only do one thing. Just help Anak Bayan. But if you do happen to have surplus money and want to give me some, join my Patreon. It helps me be able to pay for my field school that I'm going to be attending in Ireland this year. Thanks!